Well, we're going to go straight to today's business news now. Brian Quinn is with us. He's starting in the US, in fact, where the head of the country's central bank says that interest rate cuts are coming, but, got this right, Brian, not yet.
Not just yet, Stuart. Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell addressed US lawmakers on Wednesday. There's good news that the U.S. economy is still outperforming expectations, showing unexpected resilience in the face of the highest interest rates since the 1990s. And most analysts believe the Fed's benchmark rate has peaked at its current 5.25% to 5.5%. By the Fed's measure, inflation is nearly down to its 2% target. Now, the unemployment rate, meanwhile, holding steady at a very low 3.6%. Now, the less good news for investors and borrowers is that strength means the Fed will not be cutting rates before June at the earliest.
Yeah, it looks like the Fed has managed to tame inflation then without sparking a painful recession.
This is the proverbial soft landing that everyone was hoping for, Stuart, and it looks like they pulled it off. The U.S. economy grew 3% last year. It's on track for 2% this year. That is much better than was previously expected. January's jobs report came in at a blistering 315,000 new non-farm payrolls. So the labor market remains very strong. Now, the inflationary outlook for the U.S. is giving off a lot of mixed signals. Inflation has fallen plenty, as we just saw, but the pressures are still there to drive it back up, which is why the decision of when to cut is a tricky one for Powell. Take a listen here.
If the economy evolves broadly as expected, it will likely be appropriate to begin dialing back policy restraint at some point this year. But the economic outlook is uncertain, and ongoing progress toward our 2% objective for inflation is not assured.
Jerome Powell there. Now, here in Europe, new regulations on big tech firms are set to change the way we use the internet.
Big deadline coming up tonight, Stuart. The EU's Digital Markets Act comes into effect at 11:59 p.m. Thursday night. The DMA's goal is to push back against monopolistic practices by internet giants, forcing them to introduce more consumer choices. Antonia Kerrigan has the details.
It's the EU's stab at reining in the biggest of big tech, the so-called gatekeepers. Voted through in July 2022, the Digital Markets Act is aimed at preventing these tech giants from exploiting their monopoly, using one product to push others on the user. Some changes have already been implemented. For instance, until recently, the Google search engine put a clickable map front and centre, leading directly to its Google Maps service. Now only by selecting directions will the user be redirected. And the decoupling of Facebook and Messenger, as parent company Meta can no longer require Messenger users to have a Facebook account. Still to come, dominant WhatsApp and Messenger will have to open the gates to interoperability with other smaller platforms. While behind the scenes on data protection, personal data gathered through Instagram cannot be shared with Facebook through parent company Meta without user consent. Same for Alphabet and its various platforms. But does the EU have the firepower to enforce these new rules in the face of the tech behemoths? The European Commission has a team of 80 employees focused on the Digital Markets Act, while Google says they have thousands of engineers working on their compliance with it. The European competition chief says it can be done.
I'm very happy with the DMA, very happy. Also because we still have all the antitrust tools that we use in individual cases. So if creativity in illegal behavior increases, well, then we have other tools, even if the DMA would not catch it.
Admitting, though, that the bloc would have to pick and choose which cases to pursue. But it's high stakes as companies risk as much as 20% of their annual global revenue in fines for repeat violations.
Antonia Kerrigan there. Let's have a look at the markets then. How's the day's trading action shaping up?
So, Stuart, Asian indexes were mostly in the red on Thursday following those signals from the U.S. Fed as investors now see rate cuts coming later than previously expected. The Nikkei in Tokyo pulling back a bit after Japanese stocks hit record highs in recent days, with the rising yen taking a bite out of exporter shares. Chinese indexes lost ground despite exports jumping some 7% for January and February there. Here in Europe, a muted open as well as investors look ahead to the European Central Bank's next interest rate call. That's due out early this afternoon. The ECB, too, is expected to keep its interest rate at the current record high. FTSE in London and the CAC 40 here in Paris each down around 1/3%. The DAX in Frankfurt just barely above the flat line at the open.
Finally from Brian, we're going to go to Nigeria now. Criticism is mounting against the oil giant Shell, which announced last month that it was exiting the country. This is after decades of operation there.
Stewart advocacy groups say the firm cannot be allowed to leave without taking responsibility for the pollution that it has caused over decades of oil spills, that it must first safely decommission its abandoned infrastructure. Local communities are also demanding environmental restoration or compensation. Veronica Bahel has a story.
Here in Ikarama, Chidioma heads to the lake he owns. Though before he can fish, he has to separate both crude oil and dirt from the water. It used to be a source of income for the father of 8, but things have changed since an oil spill in 2019.
People used to rent this lake to fish, but now, because of the spill, they are not coming again to rent the place again. The family normally survive with that method. That is our revenue. But from the beginning of the spill now, that revenue is not there again.
Communities here in Nigeria's Niger Delta region are calling for compensation from British oil giant Shell for land damaged by decades of oil spills, polluting water and farmlands that locals use for their livelihoods. In January, the company announced it will exit Nigeria's onshore operations, selling the business to a local consortium of 5 companies for $2.4 billion. But advocacy groups are calling on Shell to safely clean up and dismantle its infrastructure before leaving, saying the government must ensure it.
Especially in the era of a just transition, especially in the era of divestment, as international oil companies continue to divest their assets, some leaving onshore totally, like SPDC recently, we are very concerned. Who is going to address this legacy of pollution?
Shell pioneered Nigeria's oil and gas developments in 1937, but often blamed local vandalism and theft for broken pipelines, oil spills and environmental pollution. And it states the new consortium would be responsible for the previous oil spills.
So a long history of not just environmental damage, but also political repression for Shell in Nigeria as it gets set to exit their Stewart.
Yeah, we shall see how that develops. Thanks, Brian. Brian Quinn with the business news for you here on France 24.